What's up, you beautiful people? Hello, how are you? Welcome to the latest episode of Games Up podcast. My name is Cameron McCulloch-Keeble, and I hope you had a good week. Let's get on with the show. The show, of course, starts with us every week discussing the news, so let's jump right into them. And the first piece of news is about Half-Life 3. This week, the writer of Half-Life 2 Episode 3, so to give you a little bit of backstory, if you don't know, Half-Life 3 went into many kind of different forms. Some say it was Half-Life 2 Episode 3, some say it was Half-Life 3, some say it was other things. Either way, at some point it was Half-Life 2 Episode 3, and it was written by Marc Laidlaw, who is no longer with Valve and has not been with Valve long enough that the clause he signed to keep any information about this hidden away and not told to anyone has passed. It passed this week. So Marc Laidlaw wrote up the story that he would have written for Half-Life 2 Episode 3 from the perspective of its main character, Gordon Freeman, who is of course known for his lambda symbol and crowbar, and he's posted it to Pastebin, basically as a kind of letter to the audience of Half-Life. It's awesome. As somebody who's not a massive Half-Life fan, this is awesome because it's a really, really cool way of keeping a game that's frankly got a bigger reputation for not being out than actually being out alive. It's really nice to see some form of recognition that people want Half-Life, and it's a really nice recognition that, yeah, this story was left hanging, and this fan base was left hanging. So good on you, Marc Laidlaw. It would have been lovely to see this as a game, obviously. That's the point of all of these stories. It's always nice to see something in its original form, in its original kind of format, especially as we now know that this story had some real meat to it. But if you want to read it, we'll post a link in the description of this episode. I'm not going to read anything from it because there may be Half-Life fans in the audience, and I don't want to spoil anything if you choose not to read it, but also because I don't understand the story particularly well, and it wouldn't do any justice to actually how important this little story could be to a really hardcore group of fans. So that's Marc Laidlaw, Half-Life 2 Episode 3, written as a letter directly to the fans themselves, from Gordon Freeman's perspective. A really, really cool little story this week. The second piece of news this week is that Amazon is having an August month-end digital sale. Now, I know that most of our listeners come from the UK, and I don't know whether this applies to the UK. All of the deals I can find online are listed in dollars. That being the case, though, it might be worth having a look at them. I'm not suggesting you buy anything because I'm not going to say one way or the other. I don't want anyone to sort of get screwed out of any money. But it's worth having a look at them, having a look at the deals, and if you can, be sure that they're going to work for your console or your platform of choice, have a look at them because there are some fantastic deals here. I've been really tempted to get We Happy Few. I've been really tempted to get Fallout 4. I've been really tempted to get the Trials games. There's a Jak and Daxter, but it's for the PS Vita. There's some really, really good deals. Definitely worth a look. The next piece of news is that whilst Gamescom was a much, much smaller affair this year, there were a couple of things announced. The first is a couple of new Yakuza titles, Yakuza Online and Yakuza Kiwami 2. Sorry if I've pronounced that wrong. As far as I'm aware, they're both exclusive to the PS4, at least Kiwami 2 certainly is, and they were announced at Gamescom this week. As well as that, we also got a new map for Overwatch, which is Junkertown. It's based around Roadhog and Junkrat, and it's kind of got an Australian setting, and there's the Queen of Junkertown involved in it as well. It's likely that when that patch hits the consoles for Junkertown, it will potentially come with some big changes for certain heroes that were also discussed this week. Mercy is having her ultimate totally changed, and D.Va might be getting some new attack abilities as well. The reason I say this, we don't usually go over hero updates on this show, but the reason I say this is because if you're listening to it, it's entirely possible that when that patch hits, one of the trophies, one of the achievements for Mercy is going to become ungettable. Blizzard haven't changed any of the trophy details before when they've changed heroes like this, and before it hasn't made a massive difference. You could still kind of work around it, but as far as I'm aware, this trophy or achievement, if they don't do something about it, will be totally ungettable, and it's the one for doing a resurrect for a number of people, because you won't be able to resurrect anymore. So if you're listening to this and you really want to complete Overwatch in that way, if you want to unlock as many of the trophies as you can, I would recommend maybe spamming Mercy for the next couple of weeks, and if you get the achievement, then that's great. If it comes out and they've changed everything and it's totally gettable, no worries, there was no reason to worry at all, but better to be prepared and have that thing if you want it, and better to save save yourself the worry in the future. So keep an eye on that. The second to last piece of news this week is an absolutely fascinating one, and I think we'll probably do a topic on it another week. But it comes from Australia, where a GameStop subsidiary known as EB Games. EB Games are known all over the world, sometimes by different names. I feel like we had them in the UK by a different name, but I'm not sure about that. Anyway, EB Games, the subsidiary of GameStop, is trialling a new service that allows customers to play any pre-owned game they want in stock for a monthly fee. Kind of like a Netflix subscription, almost to a sort of library of pre-owned games. But there's some really interesting little kinks to this. So the service is only available in South Australia, where for $19.95 Australian dollars a month, you can select any pre-owned game that's in stock and swap it for another as many times as you like. Now they mean any pre-owned game that's in stock. They don't mean like stuff from 2003. If there is a copy of Crash Bandicoot Insane Trilogy in stock, you can get it for $20 flat and then play something else when you complete it. This is really, really fascinating, and it's fascinating for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because game stores like this make their money on pre-owned games, because they have to give the money from it back to the developer. They don't do that with pre-owned games. If you buy a pre-owned game, you don't give any of the money to the developers. It goes exclusively to the store, and that's why there's such a push for pre-owned games in shops like Game and GameStop in the USA. What this is doing, in my opinion, is deeply devaluing pre-owned games, but in a really interesting way, because it's devaluing the actual cost of them, but not devaluing the experience of them. So if there's a game that you wanted to play, like say you wanted to play Mass Effect Andromeda, but you couldn't really afford it in the first few months it came out, well, it's in these shops' interest to keep those pre-owned costs, fairly close to new costs, because they set those costs. There's no other body, there's no other company involved. They set how much profit they want to make from it, and if something is selling really well, there's no reason for them to price it down. That's why Grand Theft Auto games will always be priced super high when they're pre-owned. That's why Call of Duty games will always be super expensive when they're pre-owned. In fact, sometimes game stores will buy them back for a lot of money from you when you get them new, if you can finish them in the first few days, because they want a stock of pre-owned games that they can just keep making that money back off of. Now, say you wanted to go into a South Australian EB Games and pick up a copy of Crash Bandicoot, the likelihood is that they would charge you somewhere between, and I'm estimating here because I don't know the value of the Australian dollar off the top of my head, but I'm going to say somewhere between 20 and 30 Australian dollars for it, roughly. I'm thinking it's about 40 Australian dollars new. Which means that if you play Crash Bandicoot and one more game, like any game, anything from the Xbox 360 or before, any game at all, you've not only made your money back from this service, but in a way they've lost money. They've made money because they're getting that stock back, and so it's never really of any cost to them, but they've got to get that stock from somewhere in the first place, and they probably won't make as much profit on it game over game. So if you're the kind of consumer who maybe only plays one or two games, or 2 or 3 games a year, this probably nets them a lot of money, because you're sort of paying into it and not getting as much out of it as maybe buying 1 or 2 games a year. But if you're the kind of gamer who is super into the industry, super into gaming, but doesn't have as much disposable income as they'd like, this is a major steal for you. And I don't like recommending pre-owned games at all, but I also understand that there are people who can't always afford games when they're new, and sometimes not even when they're new a year later. And in a way, this is a really clever service, and this would really allow you to get the most out of the gaming industry. So it's a kind of great service to offer. My thoughts on pre-owned games are well documented on the past of these shows. I don't like them in the slightest, and I don't like how they split the money up in the slightest. I think it's wrong. But again, I recognise there's always a need for people to access these games as cheaply as possible, and this is a really great way to do it. I think at some point in the future we'll probably discuss the actual implications for this and what our thoughts are on it. But it's fascinating, and it will be really fascinating to see how long EB Games does it for, and if they expand it outside of Australia. The final piece of news that leads onto our topic of the week this week is the Xbox One X. Despite having a pretty flat Gamescom, the Xbox One X is selling like hotcakes. In fact, according to Microsoft, the Xbox One X pre-orders have outpaced any previous Xbox, and there was even a suggestion from Jez Corden, who is a senior writer for Windows Central, that 3 days of the Xbox One X pre-orders had beaten all of 2017's PS4 Pro sales. That's undeniably big if it's true, and it certainly seems that it's getting a much better initial start than we really thought it did, especially coming out of the basically pre-order event that was Gamescom. So I wanted to ask the question, why is the Xbox One X selling so well right now? I think there's a couple of reasons. I've heard a lot of joking over the last few weeks from a couple of gaming groups that I'm in on Facebook about who is this for, basically saying they're the people it's for, and that the question is a bit null and void. I don't know that that's true. I think it's a fair question to ask later on in the console's life. A console these days can't really be defined by the box it is at the start. It's more about how the support it's shown later helps extend its lifespan. But nonetheless, I can understand why people might be a bit irked by that question, especially if they're so excited about it coming out. Microsoft have had a difficult year, and frankly, a difficult couple of years, so this kind of success is surprising. I think one of the reasons for it is the time of release. At this point, we're 3 to 4 years into the generation. People have had a PS4 because they likely bought one at the start of the generation, just the numbers suggest that way. Which means they've had an opportunity to sample Sony's exclusives, they've had an opportunity to sample Sony's ecosystem, and it's probably about this point, which is maybe somewhere between half and 2/3 into the generation, that they start considering trying what they've missed. Now the obvious devil's advocate point here is it's all on PC. And that's true, but PC gaming is more of a hurdle than just buying the platform, to most of the people outside of it anyway. It represents another level of difficulty to gaming. It represents understanding the hardware and understanding the software that runs it. It means dealing with that and being able to work it and get the most out of it. It means not being able to sit down, plug in a box and play the games. And to some people that's more of a hurdle than they're willing to jump over for gaming, myself included. So it's at this point that if they wanted to try Microsoft exclusives, another console makes a lot more sense. And if you're paying out somewhere between £200 and £400 for a box, a lot of people are going to go with the one that does the best performance. Because it's going to be a fair amount of money to pay out anyway, you might as well get something that has suggestably a better lifespan or is better future-proofed. Another reason I would suggest this might be selling as well as it is because it's fair to say it looks like it's the last console of this generation. I doubt we're going to see a PS4 2. I really doubt, frankly, that we're going to see another PS4 Slim or an Xbox One Slim. I think the way this generation will end is PS4 Pro versus Xbox One X. And so this is the point where people who haven't got into this generation yet have the biggest decision to make. Do they go with one platform that's had a slightly bigger struggle to get themselves going, but seems to have the more powerful box to play third parties on, or the console that seems to have more exclusives, but will likely lag behind in the next couple of years? And for those people, it actually makes a lot of sense to buy an Xbox One X, just in the same way that we saw PS3 grow in the end days of the last generation. Now, to be fair, PS3 really turned it around in those days, and their exclusive library really gained them some traction, The Last of Us being a perfect example and Uncharted 3 another. So the comparison isn't exactly apples to apples, but it's worth bearing in mind that I think this could be a factor as well. A final factor is hype. As much as we may poo-poo it on the show, and we do, hype sells things. That's the entire point of doing it. And Xbox has been talking about Project Scorpio for over a year now. There wasn't really that kind of build-up with the PS4 Pro. It was rumoured for a very long time, then announced in a fairly lacklustre press conference, ironically much the same as Microsoft, but it didn't have a year of build-up or devs talking about it. It didn't have that marketing machine behind it of 6 teraflops, the most powerful hardware. It didn't really have a hype cycle. Actually, It's fair to say that this is one of the first consoles we've seen with a really notable hype cycle. At the end of a generation, you can usually tell that it's winding down, and you can certainly tell that devs are gearing up for the next generation, but it's rare that a company will say, get ready for our new hardware, because that really stops people buying their old hardware. Why would you buy an Xbox 360 if you know that in 3 to 4 months they're going to announce an Xbox One? You're more likely to hold off. It's usually in their interest to call a press conference and then start the next generation going and then release it later on in the year. Build the hype cycle up by announcing the generation rather than teasing it. Whereas in this case, Microsoft teased the next iteration of their console, and that's because it's not a new generation, it's iterative hardware. It's the difference between an iPhone 7 and an iPhone 7S. They want you to know that it's coming, they want you to be excited, and they want you to have a year of excitement so that when those pre-orders go up, you're there ready to buy, rather than questioning whether it's right for you. Now that's not to say that the people who bought it, it's not right for, it's just to say that there are people who will be so excited about the console's release, that actually the landscape it's releasing in doesn't matter to them. The final reason, I think, is because of some of the optional technology that it offers. The PS4 Pro, for example, can't play 4K Blu-rays, whereas the Xbox One X can. And that may seem silly, but think about how much of a sales push the PlayStation 2 got when it was one of the first machines to bring DVD truly into the living room. These kind of optional extras don't really mean much to the gaming industry and the people who are hardcore fans of it, but for people who are looking for a convenient, cheap player of something that they intend to get a lot of life out of, i.e. Blu-rays or DVDs, a games console can actually make a lot of sense. And Xbox is really pushing the 4K message. In fact, you may have noticed they've really stopped pushing the VR message and gone all in on 4K. That's what they want. 4K TV is starting to really hit home. It's starting to be picked up by more and more consumers. 4K systems generally are becoming cheaper, more accessible and smaller so they fit in a wider range of living rooms. The Xbox One X might actually be releasing at a perfect time to jump on the bandwagon of 4K when many people are making the transition from HD to that new resolution. And if that's the case, then it will be pushing that message hard so that it becomes the games console for 4K rather than just a games console that does it. In a way, this is where Sony missed the mark on the PS4 Pro. They announced it as an upgrade, whereas Microsoft have given it a massive fanfare. Now, to the hardcore audience, the fanfare they've given it might have fallen a little bit flat, because it needs games to back it up. But to a more casual audience, people are buying in now to the 4K message and might be more excited about it now than they were a year ago at the time of the PS4 Pro. The final thing I think it's worth to consider here is that you can't ever really judge the health of a console on its pre-orders. Whilst the Xbox One X may be selling like hotcakes now, its actual popularity and market impact will be more decided in a year's time or 2 years' time when we see how those sales continued and the console's attach rate. Attach rate is how many people buy how many games per console, i.e. if one person has a console, they're likely to buy 4 games or 5 games or 6 games. For a while, one of the highest attach rates was the PlayStation Vita, where for every one console you were likely to have people picking up 16 games. If the Xbox One X has a high attach rate, it will have major value to developers, and if it has a big market impact as well, it will have even more value to developers. And if the pre-orders continue like they are, that's entirely likely. But it's worth holding fire on a judgment for now. The Xbox One X might be selling like hotcakes in the month that the pre-orders came out, but that's not how we're going to judge its health in a year's time. So why is the Xbox One selling so well? I don't really know. There could be a number of reasons, and all of them might be based around the growing prevalence of 4K, the change in time since the announcement and release of the PS4 Pro, and the depth we are into this generation. But maybe it's just the right time and the right place. Maybe people are just ready to give Xbox another go, and the Xbox One X is the one to let them do it. I think we'll look back on this in a few months' time with a lot more clarity as to how the console does, how it fares out in the wild, and what people actually think about it. So maybe when we come to looking at things at the end of the year, we'll have a better sense of how things actually went. That's been this week's episode, and we hope that you enjoyed it. Have you pre-ordered an Xbox One X? And if so, why? What was it that made you do it? We would love to hear your comments and have a discussion with you. And if you feel like having that discussion, you can join us on our YouTube or Facebook or Twitter page. We are at Games Upcast on all of those things. You can also find us every week at 6:30 on YouTube, where we publish our podcast, and earlier that day on iTunes, so you can get it on your way to work. If you feel like liking, commenting, sharing, subscribing, all that jazz, it's really, really appreciated, because it helps us get in front of a few more people, and that's really helpful for us. Thanks for listening, and until next week, the game's up.